I kind of feel like I should start out by asking you to subscribe right now. And you're going to understand in a minute. Oh, you want to find out why? Because subscriptions are a challenge that is really, really difficult to solve for a lot of people, of understanding how to make subscriptions part of their business, especially in SaaS and mobile. Let's jump in. This is Dan Burcaw on the DiscoPosse podcast, and it starts right now. What's happening, folks? This is a really, really neat episode. Okay, I may say that about a lot of them, but this really, really, truly is. I love when you can have a conversation with somebody that goes into incredible directions. You hear from Dan Burcaw. He's the founder of Nami ML. He's been at the forefront of what I call profound technology waves. This is important because you're going to hear about how he got here, how he fits in work-life balance, how MMA maps to running an organization and running a team, and about doing what matters as a new dad and as a founder. You already hit the subscribe button, I hope, but just in case, hit it again, because it's kind of ironic that we're talking about subscription services. So let's jump in. This is Dan Burcaw of Nami.ml on the DiscoPosse podcast.
This is Dan Burcaw. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Nami ML, and you're listening to the DiscoPosse podcast.
All right, it's just that easy. So Dan, thank you very much for joining today. I've definitely been looking in a lot of areas of interest that you are vastly experienced in. So both on Nami ML, and you've got a really, really neat sort of background, and you can cover a lot of good stuff. So the good thing is we've got time to explore some neat areas. But before we get too far, Dan, if you want to just introduce yourself to the folks and tell us a bit about yourself and Nami, and we'll kind of jump into first, like, what's the challenge you're solving there, and we'll kind of just take it from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. Currently the co-founder and CEO of Nami ML. We are, so first of all, this is my fourth startup. My career has sort of evolved a bit, started in open source way back. And over the last decade plus, I've been building companies around the mobile space. The last company I co-founded before this one was a company called Push.io, which was a push notification service provider. We were fortunate that we were able to exit that company, and I ended up selling it to Oracle. We ended up as the kind of mobile technology inside of a group called the Oracle Marketing Cloud. And that really informs what Nami is and why we started the company. And there was sort of two trends that we saw. The first one was that, a decade plus into kind of the world of mobile and smartphone apps, we saw that companies, or even from individual all the way up to sort of large companies, folks were struggling to both commit the resources necessary to keep these experiences kind of alive over the duration, right? There's been a lot of great apps that have shipped and maybe had a couple of releases or been maintained for a year or two, but then they kind of go by the wayside because the person or company behind it didn't figure out a way to sustain. So that's one thing. And part of what the ecosystem has done is, and this is from the Apple and Google perspective, is start to encourage app publishers to adopt subscriptions as a more sort of sustainable business model. Turns out those subscription businesses are just more complex to operate, to manage and operate and even deploy, let alone kind of build and grow into that durable revenue stream that you want. So that's one thing that we're trying to solve with Nami, is kind of build the subscription marketing platform that helps app publishers go to market with subscriptions and then take it from launch to sort of scale and optimization, so that it can be something that they so these great experiences can live on, and they can. And if you think about an indie developer, kind of, there's large companies and there's small indies. For a lot of these indies, it's a passion project. Right. And what they want to be able to do is turn it into something that could be commercially viable, so that they can keep doing what they love. And so that was part one of why we wanted to start Nami, was help app developers make this transition to subscriptions and kind of do so in a way where they can thrive. But then something else is at play too. Inside of the Oracle Marketing Cloud, building the mobile channel, my co-founder Joe and myself, we saw how these marketing systems and these ad tech systems are built, and from the inside, and they are. I'm gonna try to put this sort of politely. They're not the best when it comes to end user privacy. Right. So we've thought about, well, how do we build a marketing system? So just by its nature, a marketing system needs to understand some things about the users that you want to market to. But so we have to kind of be aware of that. But then the flip side is that if your thesis is that over time it's better for tools to try to be less privacy invasive, how might we build a marketing system that is just architected totally differently, so that it's privacy first. It lives in a privacy first world, but still can help our customers market effectively to their users. So that's the second part of what kind of was our motivation to start the company, was to not just help app publishers, but do it in a way where sort of like maybe even the first generation of one of these new types of systems that's built for privacy first.
It will, in effect, your customer focus was both sides of the transaction, which is admirable, right? Because it's very easy to fall victim to the need to chase metrics and revenue. And not that that isn't still obviously hugely important, but to do it and set aside, like, look, we just need to get data, and then we can worry about how it's protected later. And just like anything that we go into, when we're consumers of products, very easy for us to just forget how much we're giving up to get those tailored ads and tailored experiences. And we don't, humans don't care about it until they realize they should, and it's usually on the wrong side of a news story or something. And so I very much appreciate that you've seen both sides of that, and you're building towards satisfying both sides, because we have to, like, how do you tailor if you have no data? There's an unfortunate truth that you have to be able to gather data to be able to tailor the experience to create effective ways to engage new customers.
Yeah, and the conventional wisdom in a lot of these types of systems that have collected data, so be it analytics tools or even things in the ad tech stack you mentioned, tailored advertising. Some of these systems have been built in such a way where the design starts with, well, let's just collect as much as we can and then figure out what's relevant later. Well, the problem is, once the genie's out of the bottle there around collecting everything, it's really hard to go back and say, okay, well, now that we know how to tailor ads using this data that we've collected, let's stop collecting this other stuff. Like, people don't do that. These companies are not doing that, because by the time they get a couple generations or maybe even a couple releases into the tailored experience, the revenue starts, their revenue.
Yeah.
And it might kind of go crazy, and they get addicted to it. And so then nobody's ever going to say, well, let's stop collecting this other data, because all they can think about is, well, maybe this is how we accelerate what we're doing in the future by tailoring even more. So that's tricky. But I believe it's a kind of a false equivalent, or kind of a false choice around, do we have to collect data to tailor? Well, so let's put it a different way. Yes, data is required in order to tailor, but what isn't necessarily required is for that data to reside somewhere in the cloud.
Right.
Especially in a world now where these devices can run machine learning algorithms, on them to do all sorts of things, like unlock the phone. Apple's Face ID isn't built around the notion that your face, the point cloud that represents your face, sits on Apple's server somewhere. In fact, it doesn't. They've trained a model in the cloud, but then the algorithm that's tuned for your specific features lives only on your devices. And so they've kind of achieved this kind of nice ideal state where they're getting the benefits of machine learning for this feature, but without the really personal data living off your device on somebody else's servers.
It's really funny because we often forget that. I mean, like everyone's like in conversation with somebody, they say, what do you think about machine learning at the edge? Is it going to be possible?
Yeah.
I'm like, if you get an iPhone, it's possible. And they're like,
Yep.
is that edge? I'm like, yes, it's a remote device that's not, it's asynchronously connected back to some service, but the data and processing lives locally.
Yes.
We've already got this. It's not a surprise, but it is. Whenever we think of like ML at the edge, somebody for whatever reason has this vision of Raspberry Pis glued to the side of a cell tower as like is a fixed thing, but Teslas, LiDAR, all of these things, right? This is edge. We have capabilities. And, the phone, if you're using mobile targeting, I don't care about the LiDAR and the cell tower. I care. I've got the bloody thing in my hand that I need to use. That's where my user lives.
Yeah. And so it's a balance. If you want to design in this sort of way, there is a balance of well, what do I have to do in the cloud, right? Today, I can't train the full model on the device. But what I can do is I can tune the model so that you've got something that's like the base model's been trained in the cloud using sort of, anonymized or aggregate data. And then you deploy that as kind of the base model that sits on the device, and then sort of tune it, tweak, it's a minor tweak so that it's personalized for the user. So that's what's possible today. But you can imagine, a future state where the hardware is even better and better. Like, why wouldn't you want to put more and more of the training on the device? And maybe you never do at the scale of some of these types of algorithms, but that's the balancing act, is that and so if you think about other features like Siri, which is much more cloud connected today, or some of the other voice assistants, I could imagine a future iteration of those things where they find a way to tailor responses more closely to the edge than they do today. So Face ID is, an ideal case of something doing it well. Siri is probably less on that spectrum. But what happens over time? What are they able to achieve over time, given advances in the hardware?
Yeah, like could I say, Siri, what are my appointments today? It doesn't need to leave the device to do that, as long as it can do most of the active processing of voice like the playback locally, because a lot of that is living on the phone itself.
Yeah.
Now, this is the other thing too is, right, if I'm a developer and I'm creating, the latest version of Jumpy Frog or whatever, like whatever thing, even say a true like consumer application, what I love about what you're doing with the team is that I shouldn't have to build the system that does my subscriptions and engage. Like I want a service to do that. I'm in the business of developing the app experience, not the subscription experience. And so I really enjoy that you've taken that and like this becomes a service, because I think that's where a lot of folks, like you said, get hung up. They're just trying to get a developed app. They put it out there. They go through all the hoops to get it into the store. They get some early users. And then, now they have to think about engagement and measurement and revenue and all these things. And, meanwhile, like I said, it could be you or I just, spinning up some local Swift code. And now I don't want to get into the ad business. I don't want to get into subscription business. I just want to have my app be the thing that I focus on, and then just engage a service that I know is going to do this thing well.
Yeah, and one of the challenges is that the way that I'll take the Apple ecosystem for a moment here. So because Apple has driven the move towards subscriptions, Google has followed, and I don't mean that in a Google leads on a lot of things. In fact, a lot of their APIs are much better. But in terms of what they're driving their their developers to do as kind of the first step in monetization. Apple was really out first on this, and so but the way they built it, with the way Apple built it, it has been how they built everything, sort of going back to the first version of the App Store, which is that in fact, the App Store was built on top of iTunes. So when you're dealing with paid downloads in the old days or in-app purchases, you would see these little artifacts in some of the payloads from Apple that would be like, well, why is that there? And then you're like, oh, it's because this is all built on iTunes and the idea of a 99-cent track. And so you start to see some of those artifacts. And then over time, as they've added these other mechanisms, things like pre-orders or things like subscriptions, it's just another bolt-on. And so that versus kind of a fundamental new implementation. And so what that means is that to a developer, it may look like adding subscriptions is this incremental add, but it turns out it's not, because it looks like it's just this like slight addition to the frameworks. They can kind of be tricked into thinking, oh, this is just a little bit more work, but it's actually not a little bit more work. It's a lot more work. And so they spend a lot of time building the plumbing layer and not even thinking about the other things, the revenue and the purchase experience and things like the acquisition. How does it play into acquisition? Because unfortunately, most apps can't grow just on organic alone. So you have to be running these install ads in different markets and different networks. And so you need to be able to measure the effectiveness of those things, and not just of driving the install, but did the install lead to somebody trying the free trial or converting into the subscription? And because some ads may be more effective at driving that than others. And so all of those things people aren't even able to think about when they're doing that initial implementation, because the plumbing ends up being just way more work than they think it's going to be. And then once they get there, once they launch, chances are, in most cases, when you kind of do it yourself, then you don't have the foundational steps that you need in order to really succeed. And so the one concrete example around that is the purchase experience itself. And so, in one of these apps, you might see a screen that offers you, a monthly plan or an annual plan. Well, most developers hard code that screen. It's just another screen in their application.
You're either choosing A or B, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And so the issue though is that we have to, we're 10, 12 years later. People have to be able to move at the speed of the market today. And the market is moving way faster than it did a decade ago. And so if to make a little change, like, I wonder if a weekly plan would be better for revenue, or I wonder if my users would want a weekly plan more than the monthly plan. Well, to even ask and answer those questions through data, you have to be able to move fast to test, see the results, could kind of take the results in and say, okay, well, what do we do with this data? And so because these screens tend to be hard coded, folks kind of just set up their plans sometimes based upon their initial, what are our competitors doing? So they'll go and look at, if I'm a fitness app, let me look at another fitness app that seems to be doing well. I'll copy their plans, and I'm going to do well, right?
Yeah.
But it never works that way.
Well, and it's funny just like thinking even through. So I built an app that I'm using, and I do it for like sort of mentoring and connecting people up. And so I wanted to think about, how do I do this where I worked on using Algorithmia for machine learning algorithms to do all these neat ways to match people up and do criteria. It's basically a glorified dating app. It's just for mentoring, but it's the stable marriage algorithms. It's the fundamentals of algorithms. But I didn't want to build that. So I used that. And then I got all the way to the end and I thought, okay, this is great. Now I need to build the authentication system around it. And all of a sudden I'm like, I am not a developer. And I just became acutely aware. So I hired a person of Upwork to do it for me. And they did it for actually a very good price. And I was very happy. But then I thought, okay, well, now what happens when this Rails framework I'm using is suddenly deprecated? When all this other stuff, is it secure? Do I need to do pen testing? So what do? I go to do the next iteration of it. I got auth 0. just let them handle it. I pass tokens. Life is good. I shouldn't have to care about this. And as you talked about this, like as I connected it up for the first time, I thought, why in the hell didn't I do this before? Because the screen was there. I just had to check off, like, I want this to be, choose which authenticators you can have. And it could be the same thing. Like, should I choose monthly? Should I choose weekly? Should I choose annually? 3-month plans? Not like, if I thought about how much I spent developing just the goofy form and then not even thinking about the logic behind it. And that's not even subscriptions. That was just pure authentication form with like 4 fields in it. And so like this story you're telling me, I'm like, this resonates heavily because login is one thing. They're already kind of committed to me. And that's fine. I'm not looking to grow heavily. But subscription, it's a make or break. Right? I mean, Strava is another great example where even as they changed their model, they had all these fantastic free users, this incredible community. I'm a member of it. And then they said, oh, yeah, we're going to make a change. We need to kick things in. We're going to try stuff out. Well, inevitably, they've got to test some of that before they try it. Based on my experience, they didn't test well. Because most of the people I knew didn't go. They hung on the free platform and they kind of learned to live without some of the features. But anyways, the point of this is like, I shouldn't have to worry about testing that in coding it. I should be testing the results of the experience, not building the forms and the flow. It's just like, let's just lean on systems that can do this.
Well, and we've heard this before in just, conventional startup wisdom. But the ideas that we all have, that form, that first iteration of the form, you thought these are the fields that I need. Right. And then you found somebody that can go and execute on that. Or similarly, in the example that I shared, okay, well, we're going to have these 2 subscription pricing plans. And these are the ones that are going to be the ones that we always have. Well, then you get to market and you realize maybe I need to add this other field to the sign up form. Or you know what? Maybe I actually need to reduce the number of fields because I've created too much friction. I thought 4 fields was manageable by my users, but really what they want is sign in with Apple and sign in with Google. And I don't want to input any data at all, right? And you don't find that out until you see users either struggling or kind of not getting past your roadblocks, and you try to figure out why that is. And you need to be able to adapt kind of quickly. So that's it's still, and that's what somewhat surprises me, is that we're pretty deep into the quote unquote app economy, and people are still building things very monolithic or very kind of static. Because I think it's in part because we, especially if you're a large organization that puts a lot of care into kind of requirements or design mock-ups and these kinds of things, maybe a lot of pre-work has gone into that development effort. So then you're kind of locked into it, and you've got people have bought in to all of that pre-work. And so then it's hard to change, even if you do have the capability to change quickly. Then you have a different kind of organizational inertia that's getting in the way. If you're a small developer, well, you don't have organizational inertia, but you have just the pure sort of development resources required to make any change. So we're trying to streamline a lot of that in the subscription space, where people can just literally go into our website and, if they want to make the monthly package below the annual package in the list, they could just rearrange, click a button, and boom, it's live. They want to change the background artwork, they want to change the marketing materials, because to us, those checkout screens are sort of just another marketing touch point. Why wouldn't it have the flexibility that all these ad networks have, where you can just upload new creative, push a button, and now people are seeing your ad? They should be, or the App Store storefront. You can go upload new screenshots. You can change the text. You can change the title if what you originally started with just isn't resonating with the users that you're trying to attract. So we have to be able to move more quickly in a marketplace where there's just so much competition in any category that's out there.
Yeah, instead of spending time on witty update notes. That's still a thing. Remember that? There was like a couple of sort of like viral update notes, and like but it was the goal is like, how do you catch attention and maintain it? And this is, like I said, it's important. You've been in mobile and this app economy for a long time. And it's older than most people would realize as well, because it sort of predated a lot of the technology advances. As the whole thing is that the cart and horse were very parallel for a long time until the ecosystem learned from the creators, and they all kind of learned off of each other. So I'm curious on you, as we look at the size of the market, the number of apps, like I'll say the maturity of the middle tier of folks in the field, because obviously there's the leaders, right? There's, it's
Yeah.
like if I go to the top, the PayPal mafia and ask them about starting a company, of course they're going to tell me about their success because they've gotten one and it paid them billions, and then they can just talk about that all the rest of their lives. But most people are not those people. Like they're just kind of grinding it out in this beautiful middle class of app economy. So how have you seen the evolution since you got started?
Well, there is so much more competition, but then there's also way more tools at one's disposal. I mean, I shared a little kind of mini use case earlier where, let's say you want to grow faster than just organic. So now you start placing around the internet or in Facebook or in social media apps, you start placing ads promoting your app to try to drive installs. Well, turns out there's like a whole ecosystem of vendors, and there's about 3 vendors that have most of the market share, but there's more than 3 vendors. That all they're trying to do as a company, and I say that not to downplay what they're doing because it's a critical component, but that is just to say that like it's a narrow focus to some degree, is to be able to attribute whether an ad that drove an install they want to tie an install and a user back to that advertising. And because of privacy, back to the topic we kind of started on, that attribution piece on mobile is very, very difficult. So these guys have all sorts of, strategies to kind of help provide, because what it is it's a data gap that if you're spending $5,000 a month on install ads and you want to see what the ROI is on that, well, you need some way to measure that. So there's these attribution companies that have figured out ways, even with the privacy restrictions, to give you some insights into the effectiveness. And that's just attribution, and then you go down into push notifications, a space I know well, lots of vendors, right? Go into in-app messaging, lots of vendors, A/B testing, analytics. I mean, so there's all sorts of things that you can build your experiences with today from a vendor perspective, let alone what the ecosystems themselves have. The Apple SDK is so much more robust, so many more rich APIs than a decade ago. The same is true in the Android ecosystem. So the kinds of experiences that people can build are just phenomenal compared to what you would have been able to build a decade ago. But in that kind of phenomenal ability does create a degree of more complexity. Now there's more form factors. Do you want to just be on the phone, or do you want to be on the tablet and the watch? Do you want to be on the TV, the Apple TV or the Fire TV? And so things have become more complex. And I think what it probably drives is it's back to focus and just really trying to understand, like, what are you trying to deliver to the world, and focus on the right priorities and try to learn as quick, back to moving fast. If you can't learn quickly, I was part of a webinar recently where the kind of format of it was that people that were building applications would submit their applications for sort of an audit.
Right.
And there was this one application that was in the kind of productivity category. And it stands out to me because it had so many capabilities. It was like this person had invested a ton of energy into building this thing. But it also struck me that not any one thing about it was particularly memorable, right? It had so much in there. It was action-packed with features and capabilities, but nothing really shined. So I think focus is important, and because you could put in AR in your application using ARKit, but should you?
Yes.
Or just because Core ML exists and lets you run machine learning models on the device, like, is there a compelling use case for your application?
Yeah, this is as somebody who took my first idea, tested it with like a handful of people, and basically then burnt it to the ground to like this. I had to. It was a really honest self-assessment of like, okay, I'm aiming to do four things particularly well, and I've achieved none of them. And then someone says, you know what I actually kind of like is this daily journaling thing. I actually use that the most. I'm like, all right, guess what? That's the new app. and, that, and and that was it. It was hard because at first I'm thinking exactly this problem this other person had of like, well, yeah, I want to do a little bit of this. I need to add this. And like, I think of my own use case, but I'm then competing with four apps
Yeah.
instead of capturing an audience for one, which is what really mattered to me, right? It's but and then the tooling and the options, I think as well, like you said, there's lots of more sort of low code, no code, easy third party integrations. Like the ecosystem is so much better than I remember building my first, very simple, my CIO says, "Hey, can we put our web app, can we create an iOS app?" I'm like, "All right, let me learn how to code." Like I'm the ops kid that runs the data center. I'm like, "Yeah, why not? Let me give it a whirl." So I carved out an iOS app with relative ease just to basically display the web page, very simple WebKit stuff. But so and that was the end of my road in development. I'm like, I'm out, like, but like as a proof of concept, they're like, hey, looks neat. You can make a screenshot of it that wasn't even a mock-up. It was actually a picture of a real phone running our web app. And then they could go to developer and they had months of effort ahead of them. But now I could probably go and build that fairly fully functional, front end and interactive app. But again, like you said, well, now what? Now how do we actually make it stick, engage users, measure effectiveness? And this is where, like, I'm doing it even on other like just websites that I'm working on and companies that I'm advising. If you can't, moving fast is about measuring and then moving against the measurements. If you don't measure and you can't get that feedback and you can't test, and no one's moving fast. It's a total myth.
I mean, one great concrete example in the app space is there's these cross-platform frameworks now, like React Native,
Right.
And I say now, I mean some of these things have been around for a while. React Native and Xamarin and some of these things. And so if you're a decision maker in an organization and you're going to apply budget to let's be on the App Store and Google Play, you're thinking, oh, wow, I can just have our team code this once using this cross-platform framework, and then I can get to both destinations. Great, let's do that. Well, but there's a hidden cost, and actually those hidden costs are huge because the way those things work is they're basically a translation layer. So you write React code, which is, I guess, basically JavaScript with some API interfaces, and then that's kind of bound somehow. I mean, I don't really understand how it fully works, but it's bound somehow to the native APIs on both platforms. And so what you end up doing is spend so much time on the build system and just getting the native binaries out of the build system that have gone through your transition step of using this intermediary technology that you're just not releasing as fast. So now that release cycle, you might develop your React Native code pretty quickly, but by the time you like pop out the binary and it's time to test it and then ship it to, and that's if all the tests work well and you can just ship it. Well, that's one thing, but we know how these things go. You go through UAT and now you kick back to development because you've got issues you need to address before you're ready to call something released. Yeah. And so there's a real, I think one of the skills that isn't out there as much as it should is a real kind of strong kind of like I think there's CIOs and there's VPs of engineering that aren't mobile industry domain experts and that can make some of these decisions. And because they just think mobile is just another client, it's just another output layer, and that's how they think about the world. And you kind of have to be through it sometimes and ship and kind of go through some of the pain that I'm describing to then realize, okay, well, mobile is a little different, and maybe we should treat some of our decisions a little bit different. We can be informed by our thinking on how we build our web application, our web experience, but we need to just contemplate some of these other considerations. There's an app review process. You have to get through the app review process. It's
That's
pretty
right.
fast.
No free ride. It's there's a wait time and a potential impact.
Yeah, and it is much faster these days than that's been in the years past. But if you've built with one of these cross-platform frameworks, for example, then there's all sorts of edge cases that app review might find that they wouldn't have if you built directly to the native APIs. And so what looked like kind of a rational business decision to kind of write once to play everywhere may succeed, right? I'm not saying it's always going to fail, but there's other costs that will be borne out, and they may be time costs that kind of offset what you thought you were saving in terms of dollars.
It when people make the decision around mobile, and quite often you'll see the Apple ecosystem wins that first run because they're definitely number one. There's a lot of frameworks, a lot of tools to get you there quicker, and also there's effectively 4 to 8 models you got to care about, and they're even like micro differentiations in screen size between the phones versus if you head over to the Android ecosystem, God bless them, but there's like 297 different models you got to code for because of screen sizes and languages, and people customize their stuff. So it's like, I get why people just head right to the old Apple App Store and say, look, I'm just going to write it in Swift, and they spend a little bit of time in I remember Cordova, like was the Apache Cordova project was one of the first ones. And same thing. I was like, okay, if I want to be cross-platform, I should learn this stuff. I'm like, now I'm learning Cordova, not learning how to build an app that matters to people. I immediately go to like, where should I be spending my effort and headspace? It should be in creating an experience that will matter to the end consumer of this thing.
Yeah, it's really high. I mean, and that, not just mobile technologies, but all the technologies that exist, databases and cloud things, and abstractions to things. And because I don't want to manage the server anymore, so I'm going to buy a service that manages the server that deploys the database that I want to use. But then that has some limitation, and I need a time series database, and so you get into this whole thing where making technology decisions is still really, really hard. And if the kind of core reason that you're doing something isn't well articulated before you're making those technology decisions, you end up going down a path and then coming right back, maybe not right back to it, but you'll be back to a decision point again because the thing that you selected probably didn't work out in practice.
And meanwhile, some kid developed Jumpy Frog and made $1 million in a month.
Yeah, exactly.
This is what's always tough whenever like we unfortunately use these metrics of like total outliers, like people that, hey, I'm developing a video, aspect for my YouTube channel. And I'm like, people say, oh, do you want to like put in ads and monetize? And like, I'm not looking to be Ryan's toy review or Blippy or whatever. I say these names because I know them because I've got kids, but it's like, these are outliers that have put in years of effort into creating content, and that's their thing, even as overnight success as they sound. Like that's not what I want to be doing. I want to put it up so that people have a visual aspect to these conversations and they see the non-verbals that are part of the discussion. It's kind of funny. But the other reason I'm curious, you've got such a really strong history. You talked about you've had 4 companies, you've had successful exits. And whenever I see the word serial entrepreneur and I see 4 as the number, I know that's at 4 of the ones we talk about. You probably tested a hell of a lot in between. You probably had your first startup when you were around 9. Like there's always, this doesn't just suddenly happen when you're 25 and you're finished up school and you say, I think I'm going to become an entrepreneur. It's a bug. It's a piece of DNA, sequence that's buried inside you. So maybe if you don't mind, Dan, you want to talk about, the process of, your first, sort of major companies here. Like, let's talk about the 4, and even I'd love to go a bit further back into what gave you the entrepreneurial bug.
Yeah. So the first one was a company that came out of the open source world, and what we were doing was building Linux, a version of Linux, and some software on top of that version, deployed to Apple Macintosh hardware. So we were basically the commercial grade option if you wanted to run Linux on a Mac. But where we found some commercial success was that at a period of time when we were doing that company, Apple was still using the PowerPC microprocessor, and a lot of folks in scientific computing, so folks at the U.S. National Labs or in some of the military or Defense Department agencies, where they're trying to run these algorithms. We were talking earlier about algorithms that now can run on a phone. But in the kind of late 90s, early 2000s, if you were the National Weather Service or you were at NASA JPL trying to process data off of a Mars rover, chances are you could not process that data fast enough. And so what you would do is try to go find off-the-shelf hardware that was reasonably affordable, and then link that hardware together into a cluster computer.
Right.
So that was generally more cost-effective than buying something like a Cray supercomputer for these agencies. And so at that period of time, the PowerPC microprocessor had the best price per performance per watt of anything you could buy off the shelf.
Oh, wow.
And so we were selling software that would enable these agencies to basically run all sorts of scientific algorithms on, in some cases, a dozen Macs, but in some other cases, hundreds of Macintosh computers linked together, not running Mac OS, not running Mac OS 10, but running our flavor of Linux. And so that was the first one. How did I end up doing that? Well, that really comes back to just when I was in even late elementary school. So I think your 9 might be kind of somewhere in the ballpark, late elementary school, early junior high school. We had an internet connection in the library, and I started in our school district, allowed anybody in the school district to sign up to have an account on the Unix machine. And that was for whatever reason, that was like, yeah, I want that.
Yeah.
You log into the Unix machine, and it wasn't a terminal window. It was kind of this text-based menu system. And so that was okay. But there was a way that if you made friends with the system administrator, they would strip away that menu system and just give you access to a shell. And so that's what I did. And so then I'm teaching myself how to do shell programming. I'm learning about, TCP/IP and connecting into other systems, and that just I basically taught myself Unix, and then I discovered Linux, so I could do that same thing at home without having to log into the school computer. I could just put it on our PC at home and keep going. So I just learned the heck out of it and spent probably way too much time just trying to master those skills. And so what it led to was then I started doing, system administration freelancing for people through the web design, through the internet provider that we use. And that led to getting linked up with, web designers that could build those early websites, but didn't know how to host them. And so then I'd be the person that would kind of set up the systems to host them. And so that all kind of led to Linux on the Mac, which is a long story in its own right in how we even started that company. But that then led to that commercial business around scientific computing and doing things like building a cluster of Macs running on each ship of the U.S. Navy nuclear submarine fleet, running our software, which was pretty wild.
Yeah, it's yeah, and sometimes you think to yourself, like, it's not like I need to run this thing on a nuclear submarine. Oh, wait, actually, we do. But I tell you, I wish there was, if there was a Dazed and Confused for the 80s, that would be the core story. Like, it's folks like you and I who are like getting access to Novell systems and the
Yeah.
first Unix boxes and compiling our Linux kernels at home and doing all this crazy stuff, and then we would go out and party on Fridays with your friends that you'd phone on a telephone, and you'd meet at this, like, we there was such a neat experience of going where our parents were the first administrators, like our previous generation. Like, my dad went to Radio College of Canada. We had an entire family of farmers, nurses, and teachers, and he decided to go off reservation, and he went the engineering route. So as a kid, I was sitting there, and I've got a K Pro luggable running CPM, and that was like my thing I learned. So when you get to the library and they go, hey, wait a second, if I reboot this thing and I can like hit some escape sequences, I can get out to a shell. And like, that's that super, like, it just turns on a part of your brain going like, I'm not sure what I'm going to do with this, but I feel like I need to learn how to do something.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's right. It's just like kind of going where your, imagination takes you. And in that case, it was just like, well, what does it do if I do this? Oh, well, why didn't that work? Well, let me figure out why that didn't work. And so, to the other companies that I've done since, I mean, they were, so the next one that I did was I built an app development agency that I launched right on the eve of the App Store. And the idea was, in those early days, was that none of these companies are going to have Objective-C developers in house.
Right.
But there's a certain class of companies in 2008 even that are going to want to build apps. And then by 2010, even more companies. And by 2014, even more companies. And so we built out an agency that over time got larger and larger, and we were able to exit it as well. But Double Encore, the agency, and Push.io, the push service, those companies were much more sort of driven. Well, Double Encore was driven by a little bit of seeing where the market was going to go, from a guy that had a BlackBerry and wanted to run apps on his BlackBerry, and it was always an awful experience because the persistent connection wasn't there to the network. And so you'd want AOL Instant Messenger to tell you right away that you had a message, and sometimes you had to like launch the app to see that you had a message, and so it was just never quite right. And so I kind of just had an intuition that, man, this iPhone thing with kind of desktop class networking is going to be a pretty big deal, even on just edge networking in that first generation. But each subsequent startup, kind of from that first one to now, as a serial entrepreneur, there's been more and more sort of, how do I say it, pre-work, or sort of, thinking, just thinking going into, should I do this? Should I not do this? Whereas in those very early days, it's just like, this is just what we're doing on Friday. We're not going out. We're not, this is our hobby. Yeah. And so the hobby led to something that was more than a hobby, and it just kind of happened naturally. Whereas nowadays, it's just like, is this really the thing I want to be doing, or should I do this other thing? And you kind of get into decision paralysis, especially having some successes. I feel real imposter syndrome sometimes, because it's like, well, are all the reasons those other things worked out going to mean that this one's going to work out? Well, no, it's not automatic. It's hard. It's maybe even more difficult because it's a more complex. There's so many SaaS solutions out there now. I can't believe how much of the world is still built around, do you have good SEO?
Yeah.
SEO seems to like power the SaaS economy in a lot of ways. So anyway.
I used to always sort of joke with people, and they'd say, like, I was writing blogs for myself, and that's why I was a blogger. But I was writing because I needed to solve a specific problem. and I learned how to do it. I couldn't find it on Stack Overflow or wherever. And so I found the answer. I wrote the bloody answer. And then next thing you know, Google was discovering that because of just natural language SEO. And so when I came to a company and that was my job now, I'm like, hey, I'm doing blog writing as part of my gig as an evangelist. And they said, we need to SEO your article. So I'm like, no, kid, I am the SEO. Like I'm solving a problem that people have. But I had to really quickly humble myself to like, no, no, no. If we want this to really be discoverable, if you do SEO stuff, you're gonna have a fantastic impact on things. And you've got to think mindfully about how you build content, how you build the app, how you design the experience. Like there was a lot more luck to the 40,000 views a month that I was getting than there was to get, and that because I don't do SEO has naturally trailed downwards. I get articles that are older that still get hits all the time, but like now as I make a decision, I'm kind of like what you're saying, like, should I do this? Should I do this? Like, it's super easy to get hung up and you just think, it just worked last time, not
Yeah.
remembering the years of stuff you put into it to actually make it just suddenly work.
Yeah, exactly. It's so easy to look back at things and say, well, of course it was going to be successful given this other stuff that was going on in the market or kind of where we were in these big, profound, waves of change. But no, none of it's guaranteed, and there's a lot of luck. I mean, one of really what propelled two of those two mobile companies, and arguably Nami is a mobile company too, although we care about subscriptions on the web and other platforms as well. But Double Encore and Push.io, really were born out of one interaction at Apple's Worldwide Developer Conference, where one of my first engineers on the team happened to be sitting next to a guy who ended up being our largest customer. And it's like, so he hands me this. I wasn't with him at the time, and he later he says, hey, I sat next to this guy. He hands me a business card. He's like, you should really have coffee with him. I look at the logo on the business card. I'm like, yeah, I'm going to have coffee with this guy. End up at the Starbucks next to Moscone in San Francisco. We hit it off immediately, and that turned into sort of a decade's worth of very lucrative commercial work for us. And more importantly than just being lucrative, that was kind of the person that gave that company a chance.
Right.
And then, that was the person, but he represented a company. So that was sort of like the first enterprise that gave the company a chance. And then from there, it's just so much easier to sort of, for that second customer, say, well, you're not taking a chance on us as much as the last guys took a chance on us, right? And this is what their name is. Oh, okay. Oh, wow. You were good enough for them? Well, you must be good enough for us, and so that was just a pure luck. Right? Pure luck that my engineer was sitting next to that person that ended up being our best customer for a decade.
I always this is the funny thing. I'd love to actually unpack more of these. Like there's like the amount, like luck, 100%. I totally agree. Luck is such an incredible factor. But I talk about access to luck.
Yeah.
As a metric that's the real measurement. And that's perseverance, time spent doing stuff which nobody else would be willing to do. Like I'm not talking about David Goggins running shirtless at 3:00 in the morning or Gary Vaynerchuk yelling at you that you're not grinding hard enough. Like good on them. That's a fantastic thing that motivates some people. I get more humor out of it than motivation. But when I think of even my own stuff and I feel like I'm not doing enough and I'm not, and I describe stuff to like my sister and she's like, you do way too many things. And everyone's like, but that's how I've gotten lucky because I chose to throw myself at a lot of, the proverbial, throw enough shit at the wall, eventually something sticks. Unfortunately, sometimes 4 or 5 things stick at the same time and you get a little burnt out. But so, four companies in, even though luck is an incredible factor to it, there's probably a lot of lessons that you probably learned. And what does current Dan look back now and tell first business Dan, all right, this is how it's going to go, and there's this thing that you're going to think is the actual turning point and it's not, or something like that.
Well, I just think the importance of the team is so it might be the first order thing that's most important, and that's tricky because to have a first rate team, sometimes you have to spend first rate money. Right. And when you're a startup, you have to figure out, well, I may not have first rate money to spend. Well, so what other levers do I have? Or how do you organize a great team if you don't have all the capital in the world? And so that is both a challenge that is always going to be faced to some degree, right? Because like even if you raise capital, you're not raising infinite capital.
That's right.
So you still have to be careful and mindful and think about where are these dollars going to have the most impact. And would I rather kind of 4 average people because then I can cover more territory, or one really great person that may be able to cover some, maybe 2 persons worth of territory, but they're not going to be able to cover 4 persons worth of, so it's like you end up really challenged by resource allocation and how do you hire good people and also just because somebody's expensive also doesn't necessarily mean they're the best either.
Right.
So there's just really trying to sift through talent and understanding what your true needs are. What do you really need? Because sometimes in the trench it feels like, oh man, I need better SEO. Well, let's hire an SEO person. Well, do I really need to hire an SEO person, or can I get some cycles from an SEO person on a freelance basis? Would that move the needle for us? And so these are the kinds of things. And then the other thing is that I would say, like, if you just trace from now to back at the beginning, in the first company, I was more of the technology person. So I was but by its very nature, I wasn't the business operator. That was my co-founder. I was the technology person. So I was very hands-on. In the second company, I was somewhat hands-on, especially in the early days when we didn't have all the engineers in the world. So sometimes I would, we'd need to get a project over the finish line, and I'd get in the code.
Yeah.
The push company, a little less in the code, and now at Nami, hopefully a little less in the code, although from time to time it still happens, in part to keep me and maybe even the team sharp a little bit. But so I recently went on a paternity leave. I came back I took 3 weeks off. It's our first child, which is very exciting for us.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And I bring it up because in stepping away from the business for 3 weeks, I realized that I still wasn't operating as strategically as I would always like to be, right? We've got a great team that should be completely empowered to run quite autonomously or sort of with low direction, to just get the things done that we need to get done and follow kind of the strategic roadmap and know where we're heading, right? The ship should be pointing in the right direction. And
that's right.
and so it was fascinating to step away for a little bit and realize, I thought I was at 30,000 feet, but I was only operating at 15,000 feet. That's way better than 1,000 feet, way better than negative 1,000 feet.
Yeah.
But it could be better, it could be more elevated. And so what was interesting is that time away gave me this time to kind of daydream strategically, and that importance of daydreaming in startup land, I think, is really, really important. And there's ways that you can light the match for daydreaming. One of those ways is you can work out. That's right. One of the best ways, right? Jump on the Peloton or go for a long run or whatever it is. You're almost certainly going to daydream about the thing that you are kind of noodling on relative to the enterprise, because you're never really it's never off. It's never completely off. And that's okay, I think, because the difference is just that if you're always on, but active, right? I think you can be on in a passive way that helps you overcome some challenges that you're trying to solve. And that's different from just being always like at the keyboard, banging something out. So that's number one. And of course, another way to light the match is long hot showers. In my experience, those two things help you daydream. Daydreaming is usually something that helps you be strategic.
Yeah, it's funny. As a cyclist, I do reasonable distance cycling. I used to say it was long distance until most of my friends became cyclists. Then I realized I'm on the bottom of the rung relative to it. But so I say I ride less than many and more than most. And the amazing thing is, as soon as I put my leg over the crossbar and I pedal out of the driveway, the first 5 minutes, I'm thinking about which first turns to make. And then immediately my mind is in creative mode
Yes.
because I'm forcibly disconnected. And it's such a fantastic feeling. The hardest part is that remembering the things that you're coming up with, especially like on a run, half-hour run, I'm like, I can get back and I can throw it down on paper. A 5-hour bike ride, you actually really iterate on ideas. So it's kind of a different form factor. And reading in your bio too, BJJ. So you're doing jujitsu. Let me tell you, when you're rolling on the mat, you're very focused on that moment, but in those like okay, you're in recovery, like your mind is so free. That's the mindfulness thing. I can't meditate, just drives me nuts. I get stressed out thinking about meditating, but I get on a bike and I guess I'm meditating and just doing it while spinning the pedals.
Yeah, I mean, it's with jujitsu, it's in those rolls, it's slowing down your breathing is really interesting, because even if you can't figure out the solution to the problem you're in kind of acutely in the moment, it does help settle you down to a point where you at least can kind of get some situational awareness that, man, I'm hosed here.
Yeah.
And I can't figure out what to do about that, but I at least know I'm not going to die. And that if I can tap at any moment. But then that same daydreaming concept extends to jiu-jitsu. I mean, I'll have a great role, and then or something will happen where I end up in the same position over and over again, and then it's game over. And I'm like, why am I ending up there? And so then that daydreaming can take on another, or the creativity, as you mentioned, another part of another. It's not just about the business. It's like sometimes I'm just like, I'm laying in bed, or I'm doing some other workout, and I'm just like, I'm thinking about a sequence of moves. Yeah. And it's like the mind just goes there, and I'm just trying to figure it out and work it out. And then the next time I'm on the mat, you try to apply it. And I would say that is the thing that's really, really difficult about capture. You talked about the 5-hour bike ride, and kind of, you iterate a few times, and maybe you weren't able to kind of capture concretely everything that you kind of worked through when you come back. But even if you were able to, what I find is sometimes your mind's ability to arrive at a solution or an aha moment during one of those creative bursts faces reality when you go and try to do something about it.
Right.
I listened to a podcast recently where Jerry Seinfeld was being interviewed. I think it was Tim Ferriss, about his writing process. And he was talking about, like, the day he'll sit down and write something for 20 minutes, he has a hard and fast rule, which is never share what I wrote with anybody else that day. Because certainly their impression of it is going to be less than what your mind thought it created. So it'll just be deflating. And so I find that sometimes, especially with creative things, of like, if it's now turning something into a visualization, for example. Well, in my mind, the visualization was beautiful.
Yeah,
was absolutely beautiful. Pixels were perfect. Colors were great. You get into Photoshop, and it's just like, this is not what I was thinking.
Yeah, when even there's a line that I got explained. It's a quote from a fellow I'm doing advisory with a friend's company, and we were talking about. He says, we go through these sessions. He's like, no PowerPoints, no whatever. He's like, I need to socialize this so that we can effectively test our hypothesis between each other. And I even did that. Like, I built the pitch deck for the company. I'm like, this is how I see it. And I laid it out, and I was proud. Yes. And you could just see them looking and sort of like side taking notes. And then like, okay, go into slide sorter mode. Okay. I'm like, oh no. here it comes. And that sort of like incredible, like beautiful passion that I had, I've been through it enough that I knew not to take it to heart. It wasn't a dig against me. It was they're like, love what you're saying. Let's reorder this. Too many words in this slide. Like stuff that I had because I built it, I couldn't see it anymore. And to Seinfeld sort of thing, that's when you suddenly share it with somebody else. If I had shared it immediately, I probably would have never gotten past slide 2. But
Yeah.
because I said, okay, let me do my iteration. And I present it, everything when I do it that way is like, this is my interpretation of this thing that we talked about. I would love to get your thoughts on it. And I mean, 40-plus-year-old version of me is a lot better at taking that in. 20-year-old me would have been like, oh, bully on you. You guys don't know what you're talking about. This is a goddamn great presentation.
That's right. Yeah, and it's hard not to, you get invested in the work, but just the effort isn't, everybody work, not everybody, but most people work hard, and you can't attach your sort of identity system or self-worth to how hard you work.
Yeah.
It's got to be attached to other things that are more stable, because you can work really hard and somebody can, crap on your idea, and it's not because you didn't work hard. Sometimes it's because it wasn't concise enough. And so actually one of my little pro tips that I've been doing is that during this COVID period is that, I've been on podcasts, a number of podcasts over the years, but I've been amping those up during COVID. And part of it is that I've missed the ability to sort of have entrepreneur to entrepreneur discussions and conversations that are more free flowing, that allows some road testing of things.
Right.
Or when you're forced to explain something to somebody and you don't have the deck that you spent 90 hours on, right? And now you're on the cuff. And so it's been an interesting way to kind of create road test some ideas, or iterate on our own kind of messaging, or things like that. So thank you for having me, actually, for that matter, because you're part of my process now, I guess.
That's good. Well, no, and this is what's great. The reason too why I enjoy the longer form is that it lets you get beyond the talking points. And I tell this all, even like the folks that like PR firms that work with me, they're like, what are the questions? Give me the 4 questions you're going to ask. I'm like, I can give you the 1 question I'm going to ask, and the answer from it will create the next question. And when you get past about 30 minutes, it's so funny that people literally just run out of like baked talking points. It's very rare that they have that much like, scripted information in them, and you can explore other stuff. And also, I mean, I really appreciate it. You shared a ton of great information. I could literally keep going all day on this stuff. The one thing I'm going to say, I wonder, because you hear your story about like your engineer sits next to somebody at WWDC and you get the card. I'm like, this is a weird year, because that's gone. Like there's a lot of that, a lot of luck just got taken off the table. Changed the way that we think about starting something. And like you said, like, how do we socialize this? How do you validate your hypothesis with people? You really got to chase it down. Whereas you used to just be able to go to a conference and you're there for 4 days or 3 days, and you're surrounded by people that are your peers, and you can really test stuff. Now you got to go out of your way to do it. So it's a very different experience.
Yeah. I do like your access to luck thing, because in a sense, in those days, and it's still really, when it's not virtual, going to WWDC was expensive. I remember that it was a decision point of, can I even afford to send that engineer?
Right.
Should I just send him? Should I go? We had to figure out how to make that work. And had we not figured that out, if we had said, we can't swing it, then we would have missed that opportunity. So you're right. There is an access to luck element too. But right. And right now in the current world, you can publish what you're doing on the Product Hunt, or there's all sorts of forums to kind of get your stuff out there, but it's not that serendipity that is just like not being in the session, but then just milling about, milling about in the city, seeing that WWDC jacket on somebody else's back and saying, hey, what do you do? What do you work on? Oh, let me tell you what we're up to. Just like literally having some connection.
Yeah, it ain't the same on a Discord server. I can tell you that. Even as much as I'm like always towards a Clubhouse, always come, it's one of those things where I'm like, God, I really despise a lot of the sort of weirdness around Clubhouse and, like as a, like why it became popular and this weird sort of, class system that develops immediately around any of these kind of networks. But at the same time, I'm like, it's been pretty cool to just be able to get on, hear people talk about stuff, hit the like request to talk, and suddenly you're on stage with somebody. I was able to talk to Scott Kelly, who, and like, this is bizarre. There's no reason. And like, that was the me sitting next to somebody at WWC moment, but I had to really go out of my way to go get it. And I had to seek a platform that did it. So yeah, I know. We'll get there. We'll adapt. But as we come up to the close, I want to say thank you very much, Dan. You shared a lot of really good lessons. It's been a real pleasure to share time with you.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
And if folks want to get a hold of you, what's kind of the best way to do so?
Well, probably two main ways. For the company Nami ML, our website, www.nami.ml. And then, for me, I'm on LinkedIn. So my last name is usually, if I've gotten onto a platform early, I'm able to secure the last name handle because there's not very many of us, I guess. Burcaw.
That's the best SEO ever, right? I am the Burcaw.
Funny, I did that on Clubhouse. I didn't have an invite, but they have that flow where you can request the handle and then
you can set your handle up in advance. Yeah.
Thank you. And I was like, oh, that is very clever. But then what I didn't realize until I got into it was that then your friends, people kind of see that you're in the wait queue and they can push a button and boom, you're in. And so it's they really thought through that onboarding process in a way that creates a little scarcity, but it wasn't so bad.
Yeah, it was the scarcity, but it's not really as scarce as it would seem. And it's an interesting. And so tell you about poor SEO. Don't be named Eric Wright because there's a lot of them. And like the most one, of course, Easy E. So every time you try and do a Google images for Eric Wright, you see some guy with 2 9s crossing his chest. A Canadian mystery writer who's like been around since the 70s. That's how DiscoPosse is the only way that people know me because it was from a band that I was in, way back when, and we did like heavy metal covers of disco songs before Leo Maracchielli was a thing. We were doing that thing, and so I just said, like, when I came to building the first domain, I was like, what the hell? Let me just grab this for an email domain. And then I built a website and a blog, and then it just stuck. So now at this point, and if I ever said my name, most people are like, who? Like, oh, DiscoPosse.
Oh, the DiscoPosse. Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Which I've become way too used to the name because it's just attached to me that probably for people like yourself, when you get this invite, you're like, hey, you want to go on the DiscoPosse podcast? And you're probably thinking, I definitely don't want to be on what the hell is this thing? You're like, oh, okay, cool. Now it makes sense. So
yeah, it definitely is one of those, let's go ahead and listen to an episode or two. See what this is about, because does this go a direction I'm not sure I'm comfortable with?
That's right. Very little to do with disco or posses. So I'm definitely living up to my name. So, well, Dan, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to catching up again, hopefully somewhere in real life at a real conference. And again, congratulations on the new launch of your startup, your official Little Tiny Dan. It's nice to have. That's a wondrous thing. And God, I could do a whole podcast. I'd love to hear your experiences doing that during COVID. I can't imagine was an easy experience, but those are wondrous moments. And it, like you said, it makes you stop and be very strategic about not just business, but life. So it's nice to be able to open that up for people.
Yeah. Happy to, I mean, there's a whole show about that because it feels like every day is just trying to fight chaos.
Yeah.
Just when we think we're getting a little bit better, she reminds us that we're not.
Yeah, yeah. You think you've got it figured out. You read the book, and then now you realize it's. We used to joke like you'd go to the business section in the library, or this bookstore, and you'd be like, "Oh yeah, you can read all these things. I've read Good to Great. I've read 0 to 1. I've read all these things. Doesn't make me good at running a startup." Same thing. You read all the bloody parenting books in the world, and then that little human will remind you that the book was wrong. Nice. Well, Dan, thanks very much.
Thanks, Eric.